Mitch Winehouse was listening to his daughter's debut album when he heard a line that stopped him cold. He said he suddenly realized she was singing about him, about what he had done to her mother, about the man who had been living a double life in the same house for 8 years while Amy was growing up, and he had not known until the song told him. But to understand what that moment meant and what it tells us about the relationship between Amy Winehouse and her father, you need to start at the beginning. Not with the music, not with the Grammys, not with the beehive and the eyeliner and the tabloid photographs. You need to start with a house in Southgate in the mid-1980s and a family that was held together by something that was slowly coming apart at the center. Mitch Winehouse had married Janice Seaton in 1976. He was a window installer who would later become a taxi driver, a man who loved music, Sinatra, Tony Bennett, the big band standards he would play in that Southgate house until his daughter absorbed them so completely that they became part of the way she heard everything. He was also, 18 months after Amy was born, conducting an affair with a woman named Jane who worked alongside him. The affair was not a secret exactly. It was an open secret of the specific kind that families sometimes maintain, known, not spoken about, accommodated. Amy and her brother Alex had a name for Jane. They called her Daddy's work wife. They said it with the cheerful matter-of-factness that children sometimes deploy when they are describing something they have not yet been given the language to be upset about. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds an open secret in a family home. Everyone knows, nobody says. The knowledge sits in the room during dinner, during car journeys, during the ordinary routines of a household that is functioning on the surface while something underneath it is not. Amy grew up inside that silence. She was a child who paid attention, who noticed things, who absorbed the emotional texture of her environment with the same completeness that she absorbed the music her father played. The jazz records and the complicated domestic reality were both present in that house in Southgate, and both of them found their way into who she became. The affair continued for 8 years while Mitch remained in the family home. When Amy was 10, he finally left. He moved in with Jane. He and Janice divorced in 1993. He married Jane in 1996. Mitch said afterward that there was not really a negative response from Amy when he left. He said she had seemed to take it in stride, had become more independent, had not shown the kind of visible distress that he might have expected from a 10-year-old whose family had just formally reorganized itself around a reality that had been present for most of her life. He said he thought she was over it pretty quickly. In fact, he said, it felt at the time as though Amy felt no effect at all. He was wrong. He just did not know it yet. What Is It About Men was not the only place in Frank where the Southgate childhood left its mark. The album was full of the kind of emotional material that comes from someone who has been watching adult relationships closely since they were very young, who has developed through that watching a sharp and sometimes painful understanding of how love works and how it fails. Amy's writing on Frank was precocious, not just technically, but emotionally. She understood things that most 20-year-olds understand only theoretically. She understood them because she had grown up in a house where the gap between what was said and what was true had been present for as long as she could remember.
In 2003, when Frank was released and Mitch sat down and listened to his daughter's debut album for the first time, he heard a song called What Is It About Men? The song was pointed and funny and devastating in the way that Amy's best writing always was, a meditation on the pattern she had noticed in the men around her, the tendency toward behavior that caused damage and then was excused or minimized or simply continued. She had written it from her own experience of relationships. She had also written it from something older and more fundamental. The line that stopped Mitch was direct. She sang about all the things her mother had been through. It was not a metaphor. It was not an abstraction. It was a 20-year-old woman putting her father's behavior into a lyric and releasing it to the world. And her father was sitting in a room somewhere in London, hearing it for the first time, and understanding, with the specific shock of recognition that comes when someone you love tells you the truth in a way you cannot deflect, that she had not been over it, that she had never been over it, that she had carried it and found the only place available to her to put it down, into a song on her first album, where it would sit for the rest of their lives. Mitch said it publicly. He said when Amy wrote the line about all the things her mother went through, she meant his affair. He said she could not articulate it in words, but she certainly did it with music. He said it with the combination of pride and guilt that characterized his relationship to Amy's work throughout her career, the awareness that the music had come from somewhere, and that some of where it had come from was the childhood he had given her. There is a final chapter to the Mitch and Jane story that arrived 12 years after Amy's death in 2023, and that cast the entire preceding history in a new light. Mitch announced that he and Jane had separated, amicably, he said, still friends, still running the Amy Winehouse Foundation together alongside Janice. He had been with Jane for over 30 decades. He had left his first family for her when Amy was 10, and now, in his early 70s, that relationship had also ended. He said something in the interview that was quietly significant. He said Amy's addiction had put enormous strain on the marriage, that the late-night calls, the crises, the years of watching his daughter struggle and trying to help her, all of it had taken a toll on his relationship with Jane that neither of them had been able to fully absorb. He said he would get a call at 3 in the morning and run out at 4. He said he reassured Jane that there were no other women, that his absences were about his daughter, not about anyone else. He said they remained friends. He said, "None of us are perfect."
That last sentence, "none of us are perfect," contained the entire story in 5 words. The man who had conducted an 8-year affair and then left his family for the woman he had been conducting it with, who had thought his daughter had felt no effect at all, who had listened to her debut album and heard himself in a lyric he had not expected, that man, at 72, was offering the only summary he knew how to give. Not an excuse, not a defense, just the acknowledgement that human beings, including him, make decisions that cause damage that they do not always understand in the moment and cannot always repair afterward. The question of whether Amy forgave Mitch is one of those questions that resists a clean answer. There is evidence pointing in both directions, and the truth is probably somewhere in the complicated middle where most family relationships actually live. There is something extraordinary in the fact that after Amy died, the 3 people most central to the complicated family story, Mitch, Janice, and Jane, came together to run the Amy Winehouse Foundation. The wife and the woman who had replaced her, the father who had caused the original fracture, all working in the same room for the same purpose. Mitch said they got on better now than they ever had. He said Jane was even-tempered, Janice was even-tempered. They needed to be, he added, because he was a Sagittarian tiger. It was a joke that was also not a joke. It was the kind of self-aware humor that Amy had inherited from him, deployed in the specific way that her family deployed it, to say something true about a complicated situation while making it slightly more bearable to say. The foundation had given Janice and Jane a shared purpose that transcended the history between them. They were both women who had loved Mitch, they were both women who had loved Amy, and they were both women who had watched Amy struggle and had not been able to save her, and who were now, in the years after, trying to do something useful with that inability. The foundation was the shape that grief took in this family. It was also the shape that repair took. Not forgiveness exactly, not resolution, but the ongoing practical work of people who had been through something together and had decided to keep going. On the side of forgiveness, or at least of repair, is the fact of their relationship in the years after Frank.
By the time Back to Black was being made, Mitch was an active presence in Amy's professional life. He accompanied her to award ceremonies, he sat in that London studio at 2 in the morning when she won 5 Grammys via satellite, and held her hand when each envelope was opened. He was there in Hyde Park when she performed for Nelson Mandela. He drove to her flat in the middle of the night when something had gone wrong. He was, by every account of the people around them, deeply involved in his daughter's life and deeply committed to her well-being. She thanked him in award speeches. She called him 3 times a day in the last weeks of her life.
On the side of something more complicated, or at least of something unresolved, is the song. The song that she wrote when she was 20 and released to the world and never took back. The song that was still there on her debut album, still playing in headphones and through speakers and in record shops, still containing the line about her mother, still putting into the permanent form of music something that Mitch had hoped she had been over pretty quickly. Amy was not someone who said things she did not mean in her music. This was the fundamental truth of her work, that the distance between what she felt and what she sang was essentially zero. When she sang about love and loss and the people who had shaped her understanding of both, she was not constructing a narrative. She was reporting one. What Is It About Men was not a fictional scenario or a composite character study. It was a 20-year-old woman telling the truth about what she had observed in her father's house during her childhood, and what that observation had taught her about men and love and the patterns that repeat across generations. The pattern she described in that song was not abstract. She had watched her father love 2 women simultaneously, her mother and the woman who would become his second wife, and she had absorbed something from that watching that found its way into everything she wrote about love afterward. The capacity to love someone who was wrong for you, the willingness to stay in a situation that was causing damage because the alternative, the ending, was harder to face than the ongoing difficulty. The particular female patience with male behavior that she found both understandable and enraging. All of it was there in the songs, and all of it, in some measure, had come from what she had seen in that Southgate house. Mitch knew this. To his credit, he said so publicly. He did not minimize the connection between his behavior and his daughter's music. He acknowledged it directly, with a candor that was sometimes uncomfortable to read, the father of one of the most celebrated artists of the decade, saying plainly that some of what had made her music what it was had come from the damage he had done. He said it was easy for him to say it was his fault, and that had he been a better parent, things might have been different. He said, who knows whether it would or not. It was a careful sentence. It was also an honest one. What it did not resolve was the question that cannot be resolved from the outside, the question of what Amy actually felt about him in the parts of herself that she did not put into songs. The love was clearly there. The 3 times daily phone calls were real. The thank you speeches were real. The way she talked about him in interviews, with the sharp, affectionate humor that characterized her public descriptions of her family, suggested genuine warmth. He was her father. She loved him the way people love complicated parents, not simply, not without reservation, but durably, in the way that family love is always durable, even when it is also difficult. Whether she had forgiven him, in the specific and complete sense that the word forgiveness implies, released the debt, closed the account, moved on without remainder, is something that only she could have answered, and she did not answer it in any interview that anyone has found. What she did was write What Is It About Men at 20 and release it on Frank, and then spend the rest of her career maintaining a relationship with her father that was loving and close and complicated in equal measure. What she did was put the truth into the music and then live alongside the person the truth was about for the rest of her life. That is not the same thing as forgiveness. It is also not the same thing as its absence. It is something more human than either. The ongoing negotiation that families conduct with their own histories, the process of loving someone while also holding them accountable in the only language available, the acceptance that the people who shape you are rarely the people you would have chosen to be shaped by. Mitch Winehouse heard a line on his daughter's album and realized she had been singing about him. He had not known. She had not told him.
She had done what she always did. She had put it into a song, where it would exist permanently, where it could be heard by anyone, where it would outlast both of them. The song is still there. It is still playing. And Mitch Winehouse, who said he should have left earlier and spent the rest of his life trying to be the father Amy needed, is still the man in the lyric, complicated and loved and known, the way the best and hardest songs always know the people they are about.